This is a red grape that has a pretty broad spectrum of flavors if a red wine was being made out of it. So it's kind of interesting to see it made as a rosé. I won't tell you what it is. Maybe a little bit peppery too. Like it has a little bit of, we might say lift between like the CO2 and like almost like a little bit of a jaggedy sensation to it. Let's go ahead and taste it. You can spit if you're comfortable. Using cups and then just sort of dribbling into the paper cup is a great way to practice. So you don't have to actually spit, then you can just dump the cup when it gets full.
Good girl.
So for me, it tastes similar to what it smells like, but definitely some different things come out when I taste it.
So now do you drink this or?
Totally up to you. It's too early in the morning for me. So. And if we dump it out, that's fine too.
What would the expert do at a wine tasting?
The expert would probably taste it, make a note, then dump it out and ask for the next one.
Oh.
Yeah. Dumping and spitting are just part of the business. I've worked with a couple of chefs that, if you're at a real restaurant and you're cooking up 200 plates on the line, tasting every sauce, every bit of vegetable, every starch, there are points at which you're just like, I don't want to eat anything else. Just actually kind of spit it out, quick sauce taste. Chefs get really good at like tasting a minuscule amount of food, like half a pea. They just kind of like flip it into their mouths and go, okay, seasoning's okay, that's correct. So, even food-wise, we'll often spit things out. Olive oil tasting, that can be very intense. There's a point at which you use bread and things like that, but I've actually spit at olive oil tastings before too. So. Coffee probably has the same thing.
So what was in this?
It's just a rosé. But anything on that aroma wheel that pops out, I would think more on like the softer, lighter side of the fruit spectrum.
Oh, this is bigger than I thought.
Well, if you have an advantage on our backs to you.
Yeah. I mean, it's a pretty delicate wine. This thing is not beating you over the head,
No.
that's for sure. If anything, if you don't get anything out of it, the one thing I would hope that you're noticing just on the tactile side is, what is the acidity like? Is it high acid? Is it low acid? Is it medium? Keeping in mind, it would be more crisp if it was cold. It's like 70 degrees, so it's way too warm. But it's a relatively high acid wine.
What does acid taste like when it comes to wine?
Well, you don't taste it, you feel it. So if you think about wine, it's roughly the same acidity as orange juice with no sugar. And you'll feel there are different types of acid in wine, but the main one, tartaric acid, usually you feel it on the tip of your tongue and slightly to the sides. And then when you taste a high acid wine, like you may have had this experience with this, especially the first time you taste one because you just radically change the pH of your mouth, you can sometimes feel your salivary glands contract. So that's a clue as to this being a high acid wine, but a wine with no tannin. The next one is going to be a low acid wine with tannin, so that you can kind of differentiate those two experiences. Because in red wines, they work together. You've got the same two things in your mouth. And there are some grapes like Nebbiolo that are high tannin and high acid, and it could be like, wow, this is like just very, you have the most beautiful wine in the world in your mouth, but it's like so dry. And so, your tongue is glued to the roof of your mouth, and your salivary glands are like trying to balance it all out. But they're two different phenomena. In white wines and rosés, acids is sort of the backbone. That's what provides sort of the central core of the wine. And we'll often pick the grapes based on the acidity. We want the flavors, but we'll decide, like, we either want ripe fruit flavors and we'll take less acid with those, or this is an acid-forward wine and we'll take less ripe flavors so there's more acidity. There's a third element too where you filter it so that it doesn't go through malolactic fermentation, which I'm sure you'll hear about at the winery. But it's a secondary, less invasive fermentation where one of the acids changes form to the other and softens it a little further. So malic acid is very, like tart green Granny Smith apple, that's very malic acid heavy. It's almost granular and even a little bit metallic. Sometimes you want to filter the wine and keep all of that in there instead of having it convert to lactic acid. So. But did anybody get that sensation when they tasted it? So that would be like, if there was one thing to take away from these two wines, hopefully with one of them you get the sensation of acidity, and then with the next one the sensation of tannin. And both are broad topics that we're just using a single word for, unfortunately. It's like 14 different words for snow.
Are you gonna tell us the grape? We're not supposed to guess it, are we?
Oh, you can guess it if you want.
Yes.
No, I would never be able to get it. Sangiovese. So, so a relatively high acid red wine. Sangiovese is the Chianti grape. Chiantis are mostly, if not all, Sangiovese. And Sangiovese, when it's ripe, and we've done that for a couple of years in the past, can make a very fruity, strawberry Jolly Rancher. Like, you like it on the first sip, like, wow, and the third time you're like, oh, I'm exhausted by this wine. That kind of sensation, which was beguiling when I was young in my career. Now it's like the kind of thing I'm not doing. Has to go a little more nuanced and fine-grained. But it's also peppery when it's picked young. So that was, hopefully there's a little bit of like strawberry and pepper and maybe a little apricot-y stuff that you tend to get with wines of this color. But the acid is
sensitive
important.
person, would you like this?
Am I sensitive?
For a
No.
sensitive.
Oh, for a sensitive person. It is not extreme acid by old world standards at all. So German Rieslings, Chablis, these cooler climate French grapes, northern Italian white wines, it's kind of low on the ladder. In California, our wines tend to be fruitier and softer. It's just warmer here. It's pretty high acid by winery standards, California winery standards, but not crazy over the top. It's not like some wild 9% alcohol natural wine kind of craziness. Smell, aroma. I kind of hate the term aroma. It's a little ambiguous. So this is all stainless steel, just very fresh, all moved by hand. I was trying to minimize color with it. If this had oak, it would smell radically different. Once you start involving oak flavors, think of your buttery Chardonnay kind of thing. The butter can come from a different component, but that's often combined with oak aging, and you start getting that spice and vanilla and sometimes cinnamon. People say they get cinnamon from French barrels. American oak tends to be more clove. Hungarian is kind of in the middle. I think on the wine list here, you probably saw, or I think it's on the list, Obsidian Ridge Cabernet. One of the best from Lake County for my taste. They have their own Hungarian cooperage and bring over their own Hungarian oak barrels. So I would recommend you try one of those. I don't know if it's by the glass, but maybe buy a bottle and see if you can. And you have to really be familiar with barrels to say, like, I think this is Hungarian. But if you think of it like French is elegant, delicate, American is more abrasive, a little more gruff. But even that, anybody heard of Ridge Vineyard? Very famous wine producer for the last 40 years. They have 2 different wineries. They only use American oak. They were one of the first to do that. And they have, for what is supposedly a more aggressive oak that's less nuanced, they do amazing wines with it. So it also depends on what you're doing with your wine, how you're preparing the wine to go into the barrel. Talking about aromas, sometimes you'll see, especially in older books, this differentiation between bouquet, or often you'll actually see bottle bouquet, which is sort of a secondary aging in the bottle funkiness that's not necessarily inherent to the grape. So a lot of grapes aren't necessarily mushroomy, but that can come from the aging. But I shouldn't say that because red wines from Yolo County out near Sacramento are famous for having, like ripe red, full-bodied red wines, for having a mushroom tone to them, like an earthy, mushroomy thing, without aging. So there's so many different variables, though. Things like leather, there are a few grapes that can have a real leather kind of thing. Mourvedre is one of them, Syrah, a couple of Italian ones can have a real sort of like that tanned leather sort of, I'm not sure if I like it or not, but it's like a little bit weird but beguiling, kind of like truffle. A little bit of funkiness can add to the overall complexity of the wine. That's when you get into discussions of things like Brettanomyces in certain areas, which is a vineyard yeast that can make smells that range from Band-Aid, like fresh plastic Band-Aid. Those often, Rhone wines were often accused of being Band-Aid-ish because of the way their cellar yeast made that, to sausage and grilled meats and all sorts of spicy stuff. And sometimes that can morph into that reduction issue, where the wine's a little bit dank and closed in, but with air it changes. If it's Brettanomyces, it's not going to change in the same way as it will with oxygen exposure. But there's not that much of that today, so I wouldn't necessarily worry about it too much. But when you get into these more sort of, not archaic, but like old chateaus that are really into their flavor profile, sometimes you get into stuff that's actually kind of microbial and happening there. It exists. It's cool. It's part of the history and the lore. That guy I mentioned earlier, Gideon, the crazy Israeli artist with Clos Saran, he, by not allowing any cleansers, cleaners, sanitation with more than water, he is culturing his own biome within his cellar, and he thinks that somehow gets to a primal placeness with his wines. That's probably true. I'm sure a science person could probably argue with that all day long. And I definitely don't want to undervalue with the 80-20 rule what it feels like in your mouth. I mean, that kind of makes or breaks most wines. You can have super pretty smells, but if it doesn't work very well balancing with those smells, it's not gonna beguile you and make you want to come back. Talking about value, usually the longer the finish, the more expensive the wine is. So complexity plus finish equals money. That's just sort of on the buying wine side. If you're buying the promise of a $100 bottle, it should be complex and have a long finish. Usually better vineyards, older vines, better viticulture will have a longer finish. That's something that largely comes from the vineyard, though. We can ruin that in the winery. I don't think that we can create it in the winery. And I'll be pretty firm on the soapbox on that. That's one of the grounding things, is like vineyard first, that sort of thing.
Excuse me, can't that be a fallacy though?
Probably.
All those dollar signs, that's going to apply to a very small percentage of wine drinkers. I'm not an
Yes.
expert wine drinker, and I
Mhm.
might enjoy in a restaurant a $20 bottle instead of a $100 bottle.
Absolutely. I think the variable I would throw in with the fallacy is where you are on your wine journey. And in 10 years, that would be a cop-out to say, in 10 years, you'll love the dollar signs. But that would probably be the marketing person's comeback. It's like, as you climb the ladder, you'll realize. For most of us that live real, normal lives, like, when I get above $25, I get nervous. I don't do that very often. I don't. And I look at expensive bottles a lot. I'm usually pursuing that $18 to $20 interesting thing from a place that has some history and that I know something about the maker. That's my comfort zone. I don't buy $100 bottles. I love trying them. Last time I did a Napa tasting for all the Howell Mountain wines, I was like, okay, wow, $100. I can see that. Like, this thing 2 minutes later is still going. Like, I'm still experiencing, it's buzzing, it has all that minerality thing that we can talk about. Yeah, there's something to it. I don't know exactly what. Sometimes you're just paying for marketing. That's a reality. Yes.
In a restaurant, that
Oh,
$20
restaurants.
bottle of
A
wine
$20 bottle of
is
wine
40 in a restaurant.
in theory is 40 to 50
Okay.
with normal restaurant markup. Though that's changing though, as the restaurant industry changes, people are bringing debt. I should step back a minute. It's splitting, bifurcating. People are either raising their bottle prices even more to make up for how the restaurant is losing money somewhere else. That's very common. But the trick is that if you can go to the store and get that same bottle for 20, you're not happy with that restaurant. So restaurants need to be very careful about how they do that. And if your wine list gets so weird, I know if I go to an expensive Italian restaurant and look through an Italian wine list, and I kind of I was sort of the Italian wine guy at the retail shops, I don't understand half of what's on that list. I can't even tell where half of it comes from because it's so, micro, commune, little village. Montepulciano, the grape, is not grown in the town of Montepulciano. It's Vermentino has 5 different names in Italy, depending on where you are. It's very confusing. Some areas labeled by grapes, some labeled by the historical village that's the town center, and it's all over the board. So, yeah, restaurant pricing, expect to pay double. There are a few oddball restaurants. There's a restaurant, if anybody ever goes to Carmel or Monterey, just in between those two towns, there's a restaurant called Passion Fish, which is a seafood restaurant that has a super aggressive wine list full of amazing stuff, starting at $25 at retail prices. So that bottle that would be $50 at the restaurant, they have it for $25. Now, if you want to bring in your own bottle, instead of $10 corkage, they charge $50. They want to make sure you buy something from that list. But I have no problem with that because it's a fantastic list. They've got so much stuff under $30. That would be great. From interesting to like Chablis, traditional.
Where is it?
We're in it.
Pacific Grove.
Pacific Grove.
Yeah, so just one town south of Monterey, I think one town north of Carmel. Oh, yeah? Cool. Yeah, that's a really cool list. I haven't eaten there yet, but every single person I know recommends going just like to enjoy the wine list and get some reasonably priced food. How they do that, I don't know. As a restaurant consultant, I'm very curious to go in and see how the sawdust floor, like you gotta make up that money somewhere. Do you have to go pick up your own food at the kitchen? There's gotta be some way to make that work. So, yeah. If our aroma perception tends to converge, if somebody at the table gets cherry, most of us are probably getting cherry. The tactile aspect, I think, is where we get more difference. I just had a wine yesterday. I opened up a bottle of something I'm going to release in June. My friend tasted it. He was like, I can't, what is this? And I was like, this is only medium tannin, dude. What's wrong with you? And we got into it. It was a discussion. It was starting to verge on argument a little bit. Like, no, this is, and we actually had to call up 2 friends, have them come in. I won, so. But we talk about tannin, like, tannin. Tannin is a very broad category for this sort of parching, drying sensation. Tannin has different shapes, it has different molecular shapes, which affect how it interacts in the mouth. There are, we make 2 wines that have tannin that is perceived differently by 2 groups of people. Most wines, everybody agrees. But there are 2 grapes that in particular, I can guarantee half the people think it's smooth, the more tolerant tasters, and the other half find it like face-ripping unpleasant. And I don't even like the grape. So I'd like to graft over to something else, to be honest. But it's kind of fascinating to be able to watch that. That said, let's sniff the second glass and then take a taste. And I won't tell you what this is, but it is a grape that is this particular vintage, pretty low acid, but it has a lot of tannin. So when you taste it, you shouldn't have the same acidic sensation, but you're going to get potentially a lot of sort of that chalky tannin sensation. Actually, it's not quite as much as I was expecting. But it sort of hits your mouth in a different place than the acid, right?
Yep.
For sure.
Start sort of going to the back.
Yeah.
Different types of tannins sit on top of the tongue differently.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get into that category of astringent wines, where the tannin and the acid start like sticking to your gums. So it's binding with the proteins in your mouth. And one of the easy ways to get it confused with acid is that you'll produce saliva, basically, to try to neutralize that as well, just like you will with acid. But you get the chalkiness, right? That kind of sensation. So this wine, you eat it with bigger, heavier food. It likes to bind with protein because of that tannin, so you feed it a grilled steak or buttery pasta or something else that can sort of interact with it. Cream can kind of have an effect in the similar way. Butter finished pastas, pork ragu, something like that. You know, you can pack a lot of. If you know the wine is going to be super tannic, you're making dinner to go with it. Go ahead and slip in an extra little pat of butter to a French style. I've worked with a lot of French trained chefs. I'm ashamed to say that when I make most of my Northern Italian, Northern Italian you're supposed to, even Southern Italian pastas, which would not use butter generally, you can either emulsify it into the sauce to kind of soften and broaden the mouthfeel, or, and I learned this from the New York guy, you put just a little bit of butter sauce down on the plate and then put the pasta on top so it's hidden with a little bit of shallot boiled in it. So, kind of creams things up, adds a little tangy goodness. Tannin is not something we would necessarily enjoy naturally, but I know I've come to appreciate tannin in wines as my wine journey has continued. I feel differently about it. I wouldn't expect a 6-year-old child to like that wine. I'm not sure I would expect 90-year-old me to like that wine, but the tannin part is interesting in what it's about. And with age, those tannins can change shape, they can soften. The trick is to not lose the fruit tannin balance, because then if the fruit starts to dry out, or if the tannins, sometimes they get too dry, too parched, then it just doesn't get any better with age. So, and some of those really rustic wines are like that. They're kind of over-extracted, or the tannin wasn't ripe enough to start with. So when we're picking these big, heavy reds, I actually will get to the point where I'm not even tasting it for fruit. The only thing I'm paying attention to is how that tannin feels, because that's like the main driver of the wine, is that sensation. And when you pick it, sort of determines what you have to work with. And the old tasting map, just sort of disregard that. Things are sort of clustered, but there's a lot more neural interaction. Taste buds are much more complex than just counting bumps. Different types of acidity. With acidity in particular, there are actually 4 different types of acid in the wine that when you drink it, you can actually, if you start really getting into it, you can tell where they sort of dissociate on the palate. So you'll get tartaric up front, malic would be somewhere, lactic will be farther back because they interact differently, and you can actually feel them in different places. But we just use the word acid like they're all the same. Spices, bitter is a big thing. there's some bitterness in this wine. A lot of Italian wines have sort of a bitter little twist at the end. That's something that's intentional with some of these. Want to have a little bit of like savory, not like Amaro super bitter, but just a little, just a little nudge of bitterness on the finish. Kind of keeps you coming back to it. But not for everybody. That sweet taster would probably, well, sweet taster's not going to drink that one. But in theory, that might be too much depending on where your natural hardware sits. One thing to think about though is eating crusty sandwiches before tasting big reds or acidic whites really skews the tasting. Our mouths are really sensitive and we get abrasions, cuts, all sort of stuff all day long. And we just, they're constantly regenerating. It's like our internal, our entire digestive system. So if you eat a crusty sandwich, like nice crusty French bread with the big ridge on the top, I guarantee you probably have about 50 cuts in your mouth at the end of that. And the acid in the wine will find that. And the tannin will also. So when you do professional wine judging, like you'll go through everybody's room and make sure they don't have anything hard or anything that might, affect the perception, because it really does screw stuff up. Coffee, I did a wine judging. It was a long drive. I drank a lot of coffee. I wasn't able to reset my palate before it. And the first couple of wines we drank, it was like, oh, these suck. It was a Gewürztraminer category. They were super bitter to me. And that's one of the main things when you make Gewürztraminers, you want to avoid an excessive level of bitterness, which is inherent to the grape. And it ended up being the sweepstakes winner. First. And we went back and tasted it, and I was like, oh, I'm so stupid. Like, we circled back. Yeah, this is beautiful. It's amazing. It's just because I was sipping coffee 90 seconds before, didn't like clear my mouth, gets all set up, and yeah. So the external stuff as well as the internal stuff affects our perception.
On the earlier slide, it said to avoid rinsing with water. Why?
That works for some people. I find for me that it makes the next couple of wines taste strange, or makes it overemphasizes the tannin and things like that, and somehow I'd rather rinse with a really boring white wine, just to sort of keep my mouth calibrated on that category. The other thing I might have meant, rinsing a glass with water. A lot of people are like super religious about everything they taste. Then they want to rinse with water. And when you go from whites to reds, you end up with a pink in between, sometimes going back and forth. And that can be a little bit jarring. I find that when you rinse with water, it volatilizes the alcohol on the next wine. And it makes it seem over alcohol-y. So I will actually resist rinsing the glass out. And if you go to fancy schmancy tastings, they'll give you a little rinse of another, like their competitor's white wine. Just to keep everything kind of primed and flowing. So some people feel totally differently on that. That's my 2 cents. The issue of balance. Oh yeah, yes.
Would you give us the grape on this second one?
No. But it's not released or anything like that. But it's a big Southern Italian red.
Okay.
So it kind of I think you can kind of get that from, it's like kind of rustic. It's kind of it's got a little bit of funk to it. But it's something that actually ages pretty well. So,
What is the reason that you won't give it up?
this was an experimental little thing.
That's
So-
what's it-
So I
it's
wouldn't
secret.
want to adjust or skew anything. So the issue of balance for one person may not be balance for another. These days, people are really into this lower alcohol, fancy schmancy. I like delicate wines, and this has kind of gone from the heavy, thick, big. If you've heard of Robert Parker, he became sort of the pinata in a lot of ways for the 100-point wine reviewer that likes big, bold stuff for cigar-smoking men. And now, like if you're in the hip Bay Area or Williamsburg or something like that, some very urban, international, francophilic hub, then it's much more like over on this side of delicate, less fruit, lower oak, That pendulum will swing. So give it 10 years, you'll turn out to be right anywhere on the circle. I think it's swung a little bit too far. I'm not a big fan of the Francophilas, so I'm just going to let that go. But judging balance, that's a tough one. And lighter wines, it's kind of easier to get a sense of balance. Pinot is sort of the poster child for balanced, lighter reds. Cabernet balance is going to be a little more full bore experience. Sangiovese is in the middle, the Chianti grape, Brunello's. But the balance points of different grapes are in different places. So some grapes on paper would never be balanced just because they're either too tannic or too acidic, or they don't have enough color, or they're too spicy, whatever that means. Can have a beautiful balance of their own. But generally, when we're assessing balance, we're thinking of at least all these things together. And the sensation of minerality, that bottom term, is a source of much debate. Some grapes seem to show it. It's easier to find in white wines because they just have less stuffing. Some people speak of a mineral smell, which is more like a wet rock, sort of sea spray, like a little bit salty, a little bit calcareous. There's a term called petrichor, which is a smell of fresh rain on pebbles, that peculiar smell. But there's also minerality on the palate, which is sort of like a buzzing sensation that goes on the deep, deep tongue, sort of moving down. Priorat red wines are famous for that. Nebbiolo has it. Older vines tend to have more of it. I will admit the term is cumbersome and clumsy and used inaccurately. But getting minerality into wines for me is sort of the holy grail, sort of expanding that length of finish and sort of being able to frame it. So, but it's one of those things like, I know it when I see it, but I sure have a hard time explaining it. So, yes?
Well, if you say something you smell plum, does that mean that wherever this was grown there were plums?
No. These are just similes. So we're just using it as a metaphor. So yeah, it doesn't mean that the strawberry rosé was grown next to a strawberry field. But sometimes wine will have the exact same molecule that occurs in something else. These are all, botanical products.
So what about the oak part of it?
Well, the oak part adds in like a third factor. So the thing that I'm allergic to in oak, eugenol, is the main thing that's in cloves. It's the same actual chemical.
This was in the barrel, or
Yep,
what?
it's something that naturally occurs in oak wood on some level.
And if there was no oak barrel in sight, you would not, because when somebody asks you if you want an oak or buttery wine,
Yeah, like an oaky Chardonnay.
what are they asking you?
If they ask if you want an oaky wine or like an oaky Chardonnay, that would mean a Chardonnay that's been kept in barrel until it absorbs some of the oak flavors, which will be some vanilla. The butter thing actually comes from a different mechanism, but often those two things are put together. But you get like butter, maybe black pepper, maybe some nutmeg, and then often it's coupled with the diacetyl, which is the buttery flavor, which has to do with malolactic fermentation. And then I do a stainless Chardonnay, never goes into barrel. It's focused on sort of, because we're warm here, like kind of a pineapple-y tropical element. And then I manage the canopy in such a way that the morning side doesn't get sun, so it has like a crisp green apple. Those two things come together. I keep it in stainless steel for 6, 7, 8 months, and then bottle it. And it doesn't have any of the oak flavor profiles. You just get the grape. But it can still have a little bit of butter, but there's no vanilla to it. But oak is very complex. A lot of stuff comes out of oak. It has a lot of different flavors. Just talking with the gentleman, like, where does your oak come from? Hungarian oak can be different than French oak. And there's a joke, what is French oak? It's any oak sold by a Frenchman within the wine industry. So it may not even be coming from France. Acacia wood has become very popular. Increases the body of the wine without necessarily having all those spice and vanilla elements. It can be very barbecue-y at first. and then very neutral. Like it's a whole other world of oak flavor profile. But oak in wines is a big topic, and it takes it's probably taken me more time to wrap my head around, like what are the oak flavors, what are the wine flavors. It's a lot of nuance and interaction there, especially since all of us are using barrels on some level. And maybe a barrel that's 3 years old has a little bit of oak flavor life left in it. So new, like a brand new barrel that you just got wrapped in plastic that you put wine into, when it comes out of that barrel, say a year later, it's painfully oaky. Very spicy, very clove, very pepper, a lot of tannin from the wood, maple, brown sugar from charring the wood. A lot of flavors go into the wine that way. And usually that's too much. You won't find many wines that are 100% new oak. It's just so powerful. Yes?
Just have to remind you of the time, or just after 11:30.
Oh, I will go faster. We're coming up on the end though. We're probably too close to take a break, but Chris, are you up for pouring?
Sure, yeah,
Pouring
third
two
one,
wines?
we haven't tasted our third one yet.
Okay, that's okay. The third one's not actually for tasting.
Oh,
Can hopefully we didn't mess up the order.
No.
Okay.
I think so.
Maybe we can go ahead and take a sniff of the third wine right now. This jumps ahead a little bit, but take a sniff of the third wine and let me know if you smell anything unpleasant or unseemly. I didn't bring bags.
Okay, I'll hide it.
And can you dump out number 1 and number 2 also into either your spit cup or the dump bucket if you're too far away? So when you smell the third wine,
Mothballs.
oh yeah, I get like a mentholy
Yeah.
sort of thing. So number 3, you can taste it if you want, but I recommend you don't. So the issue of cork taint, TCA, or saying that a wine is corked. This wine, my cork producer gave me a little bit of cork taint in a vial. So I poured it into glass number 3. Is anybody and this is pretty light. It actually came out a little lighter than I thought it would. But does anybody get like a damp paper, kind of wet basement? Yeah. So that's the cork taint smell. So when you smell that, if you buy a bottle and you smell that and it has a cork, just take it back and tell them this is corked. If it smells like this in the restaurant, just say, hey, I think this is corked. Wine still has, everybody fights about this, but about a 3% chance of being corked. And it's just a little microbe that lives in natural cork, and when they clean up the corks and the little natural, because this is just the bark of trees, it's real world stuff, so there are microbes. We got to get over it. When those little creatures die, they secrete this compound that for some reason humans are super sensitive to in the 3 parts per trillion level. So 3 drops in an Olympic swimming pool. But what it does is it actually, the smell of it numbs your sensory bulb in your nose. So you might notice that, like, if you don't smell the moldy basement or damp paper, and I'm not actually getting it as strongly on that one as I expected, but you'll notice the wine seems kind of hollow, like something is missing with it. Or if you taste it, it would be all texture and none of the fruit or pretty stuff, or that will be suppressed. That's that bulb in your nose actually being anesthetized for a quick little period. Don't know why we're so sensitive to it. There's some, bioarchaeologists that think it may have been something that prevented from rotten meat somewhere in the past. Who knows? But that's corked wine. The number 1 thing to watch out for after reduction. Should get some sense of that. So, just a quick detour through sugar in wine. There's always some very small amount of sugar in wine, but just the yeast can't do everything. But we're talking about often 1 part per 1,000 of glucose, just a tiny bit. Champagne styles are governed by the amount of sugar that's left. They actually will add sugar back to it. They're very high acid wines. Super crisp is in style, so you see a lot of the Brut Nature. But champagnes used to be super sweet. You know, when you're at 32 grams, that's quite a few tablespoons in a bottle of wine. There are lots of really great sweet Rieslings. Really high acidity, they have some sugar, it all balances out. The trick is that when you're buying cheap wines from Gallo, they'll sneak more sugar in there to make them fuller, make them go down easier, make up for the grapes that maybe weren't quite as ripe. So sugar is a tool. I've made an off-dry muscat quite a few times. So you let it get to almost the end of the fermentation, then you freeze the tank so that the yeast dies. And that leaves about 7 grams of residual sugar per 1,000 grams. Just a little bit. Teaspoon and a half, but it sure changes how the wine feels. So it's a powerful tool. The important thing I would ask for you when you communicate what you want with a wine shop or a waiter, keep in mind that fruitiness is not sweetness. Now that I'm working in my own tasting room, we have the sweet discussion 20 times a day. This wine is sweet. Okay. There's actually no sugar in it, and if you open a bag of sugar, you can't smell sweetness, and that's the definition of sweetness. Is it fruity? Okay, yeah, it's fruit. It's very jammy. It has like a raspberry jam sort of smell. Okay, that can be a sweet smell, but that's not sweetness if there's no sugar in it. But there's a lot of stuff that goes on in between. But for those of us that want to help you find a bottle or choose a bottle at the restaurant, being able to articulate between like California jammy fruit and then, oh, I want a sweet wine because I'm a hypersensitive taster and I need that sugar to help adjust everything. Those are 2 different topics. So that's more for me on my side, helping people choose wines to try to understand. And that's just because, as a culinary and wine culture, we just didn't discuss these things around the dinner table. I know I didn't. My family, we never differentiated between any of these things. It took 5 years to start to understand what it meant. And going back to acidity, if you're pairing a white with food, kind of acidity is what you're pairing. If you're pairing a big red with food, then tannin is sort of what you're pairing. Just general guidelines. So you get into the whole like rich whites with cheeses, something, chicken and cream sauce you can do with a heavy white or a light red. And those categories start sort of rubbing up against each other. Bigger reds with smoked meat. I've had a lot of really good pairings with things that should not have worked on paper. Just had a really good, not too long ago, a really fantastic Rhone white, very honeycomb peach, like big, full bodied, with a super simple arugula salad that was amazing. It worked by counterpointing. The wine jumped off the salad jumped off the wine, and they kept going instead of being same together. And when you hear the term old world, which is being sort of phased out, but we still use it, usually that means higher acidity. That's another code word for like higher acidity, low alcohol. But it's getting, we're trying to do that in California too, so that's breaking down. Let's jump ahead of the white wine and try the red wine that Chris just poured. So not the corked one. But the other red. The colors are probably going to be similar, but the new one should be a little bit darker.
You can tell by the
Smells
smell.
better. Yeah, it smells.
Yeah, well, they'll definitely
If you
smell different.
mix them up and can't remember.
That's definitely more forward than the corked one, right? Anybody want to throw out any descriptors?
Initially, it didn't smell all that appealing.
Mm-hmm.
It
This-
tastes better than it smells.
This is a grape that's prone to reduction and does need oxygen, so that may be part of that phenomenon. Earthy? Yeah. But on like the darker fruit side of the spectrum, right? Heading into plum and blackberry maybe. Purple fruits, not so much strawberry and lighter fruits. Does anybody get like a minty sort of little bit to it? Like an almost herbal, some sort of little herbal twist?
Oops, I'm sorry.
Uh,
This,
I,
this is a dry wine. We would consider it a dry wine.
I haven't tasted it yet.
Oh,
Most likely, yes.
because it's a. I call it a soft dry wine, or maybe my
That's probably
drugstore.
accurate.
Yeah, supermarket dry wines are dry, and this. I mean, this
Mhm.
just tastes so much better.
Is this pretty dense?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this
Yeah.
is Petite Syrah, which is a pretty big, dense, bold, dark grape. It does very well in Lake County. It likes a lot of heat. It kind of gets some of those jammy things, but it's more robust than its Zinfandel. I haven't had this one before. A little bit of oak, but not too much. There's like a little bit of spice, kind of mid-palate, that I think might come from oak.
Nice.
But I feel like the fruit is probably speaking pretty clearly on this. Sometimes people over oak Petite Syrah because from other areas it doesn't have that much fruit. Sometimes it can be very flat. Say throw it in oak to kind of boost it up, but I think that shows through pretty well. So that's definitely California. If you had a French friend who came over from Burgundy and tried that, they would spit that out in a second. Because on the global scale, that is big, bombastic, new world, their loss.
It's the Chasewater Wine Company, Petite Syrah. We'll be going there on Thursday.
Yeah. They do quite a few different grapes you'll be able to try there as well.
Mm-hmm.
And Petite Syrah is famous for having pretty high tannin level, but it's not as dry and parching as I expected. It's actually pretty smooth and nicely handled. Sometimes, especially in Petite Syrah, it can be very gritty, almost like a mouthful of gritty dirt kind of thing, which can be attractive. I know it's not sounding like that, but it can be a unique element to it. And there's a lot of tannin both in the seeds of Petite Syrah and the skin. So that's often, sometimes some grapes have more in the skin and less in the seeds, like Merlot. The ones with really big tannin often have tannic seeds.
Would I get a difference now if it was out of a vineyard, say down in Lodi, and